the first part of this is to talk about just adapting the environment. And I say through the eyes of autism because if you can pull that perspective in when you go through the environment, we as professionals who work in these environments every day don't see what somebody who doesn't sit in that environment every day. You have to bring in somebody who's going to open your eyes to where the challenges are. Um, and I will tell you, parents and just the kids themselves when they're there really help me kind of see where our gaps are, and so use them. There is more emerging research on autism in the emergency room and in hospital settings, and it's kind of increasing now. There's a lot of interest in safety and improving the experience of all people in the hospital. Um, but just know that they are, what we've found lately is they're 4 times more likely to use the emergency room services. And so we have many families who kind of avoid going in for regular care because it's really hard, and then they end up in crisis needing medical care in a crisis situation because it's hard to get to, or they haven't been well received, or they don't get support when they go in. So that's some of the reasons. The other part is in rural areas, this is even more compounded. And it can be because it's hard to find specialists or people who agree. We have some parents who will share that they have a rough experience in one place, and then they're scared to go somewhere else. So that is another thing. It isn't that everybody might treat their child poorly, but they are worried about how they're received. And so they will end up avoiding some of that care. So it's really important for us to make sure that even though autistic people can be challenging in our emergency rooms or in our hospitals, that we want to help them, and that we want to keep them coming in to get the care they need, and that we want to build the resources in the outpatient world also for them to get their care. So when we do a good job inpatient, but there's nothing to receive them in outpatient, we still struggle. They still end up just coming into the environment. We can still make it better, but it is important to try to get it across the entire system. Emotional regulation is often an impairment in autism, and so that is significantly associated with challenges. Increased need for emergency room, but also just challenge within the hospital. Some of the physicians and nurses in their surveys have reported, the environment is a challenge. They're competing demands. Emergency room is hard. The way we provide care is hard anyway. And when you have someone who needs you to slow down and gather additional information beyond what you typically do, it can really disrupt the flow of care. And I want to say that out front. I totally recognize that. What I typically say, though, is when we slow down to provide that care, we actually go faster. If we try to rush it like we normally do, we end up with lots more obstacles than we do by just adding time onto the care. So it's worth it to slow down a little bit when we're working with children, especially those who are nonverbal or highly stressed. And then, of course, the larger they get, the older they are, those with significant behavior are very challenging. And if your team has a plan for how to manage some of that, boy, it goes so much better. We've learned that over time. And I'm going to show you a few slides on just some quality improvement work that we've done. And they won't get you the whole nuts and bolts of it, but just to show that this work can be done very effectively when you get the whole team kind of rowing in the right direction. So parents report, they worry about safety. We have a lot of parents who I've told are restraining their own children in hospitals, laying on top of them, doing all sorts of things. I've had to extract parents off of their children because we have a team that will help them, and they don't have to be in the bed getting beat up, trying to hold their child, to be safe from everybody else, or to keep everybody else safe from their child. But we have parents who come in horribly hurt, and they often don't necessarily express that completely, but parents will develop PTSD. They can develop similar symptoms to somebody who has domestic violence, even though they know this child is not trying to hurt them. Then the amount of stress is pretty much unbelievable if you work with these families all the time. And so we really have to look at the big picture around families and make sure we're working with them and keeping the family safe as well, without again, blaming the child who's just trying to struggle through their own situation. Staff knowledge is definitely a concern, and so training staff is really important. And then again, they want to be a partner in the care. I'm also going to throw out there that I'm gonna be a big proponent of partnership with parents through this whole process, but also know that some parents have not been partnered with, and some have their own challenges, and so they don't all partner well, and that's also known. But we should still always start there. Um, and some will, will say, "I don't know." We have parents who say, "I can't do this anymore." There's every scenario in the book, and my hope is that you will greet each of them with grace and gratitude and compassion, because they are often in this alone when they're without the proper resources. And so it's just a really hard thing to do every day without help. So just kind of keep that in mind when approaching. And then common challenges are, again, the noncompliance, hyperactivity, sensory defensiveness, and self-injury were listed in this one survey as the top challenges within the hospital setting. And then focusing on that communication, sensory management, and strategies, and pain management were super helpful in that work. So this is just a quick overview. There's quite a few things, quite a few articles out there. There's more emerging. A lot of them are really just what I call admiring the problem at this point and studying it rather than a ton of how to get it better. But it's still very helpful when you're thinking about how to approach. And what we know when we're looking at our hospital environment, which is where we're starting, is if within the diagnosis, you're going to be more prone to anxiety, difficulty with attention interpreting, et cetera, then anxiety in these really challenging situations will come up higher than it would if you didn't have those challenges. So anybody coming into our hospital doors with an underlying anxiety disorder is probably going to have more stress. Any person with autism who comes in and struggles to understand and manage environmental stimulation and social cues is more likely to have a reaction to those situations when they come in. So being able to help them quiet the sensory overload and make everything predictable is one of the biggest things that we can do. When they study background noise on impact on children with autism, they find that it increases behavior, right? So just normal classroom environment. Now go to the hospital and add beeps and alarms and crowds and overhead codes and all sorts of things, and you increase that immensely. I hear of kids all the time struggling in the gym at school. There's lots of the foot noise, kids are louder, there's the overhead noises, etc. And again, I would say that's nothing compared to an emergency room, or if they're in the ICU and they have all the bells and alarms. And we know that staff are trying to get to alarms as quickly as possible. They don't want parents to silence them because they need to hear them. Yet if they're going on and on and on, that child can get more and more upset over time. So we have to be really cognizant of all the normal things that can go awry in the hospital. And then individuals with autism will commonly over or under respond to sensory stimuli, but it's not the same for each person. So some do not respond to stimulation as quickly, and some have this hypersensitivity. And so every child is a little bit different, and we have to think about each one, but we should just keep an awareness that, especially for the over response, that this can be a concern in our hospital setting, and we have to think about all the alarms and lines and leads and touching that we do. Under response is usually the biggest problem when it comes to pain. And under responders may tend to under respond to pain and then go over the top once they've hit that threshold. And so it kind of comes looking like it's out of the blue, but it truly is just an under response until they hit their threshold, and then it's an overreaction. So we get desensitized to this setting. We have to recognize that we're desensitized, and we have to look at that environment through the eyes of autistic people and their stressed families to be able to think about adapting that environment. When we do environmental assessments, I have found it super helpful to walk through. I used to do this with my clinics in different places. When I opened up the day treatment program, we had a space that we had, and then we built a new space. And I took a couple of the parents through the space before we opened it and just got their view on What do you think would be hard? What do you think, is helpful? And just give me a fresh perspective, because we tried to design it in a positive way, but we also wanted to make sure we had input from families. So those things are helpful. You can't change everything, but just getting that perspective from a family, or if there's a child who can walk through it and think about it with you, that's also helpful. If you can do this in a safe way, even if the child is nonverbal, they might just, what they gravitate to and avoid in an environment gives you input and feedback. And we have to think with all of our senses, to make sure that we can kind of think about what we need to adapt or be aware of. So we can't change everything in our environments, but we can at least understand our environment so that we know what the hotspots might be. And then that helps us bring in additional interventions to address, even if we can't, tear down the place and start all over. We also have to look at our environment through the eyes of safety. So you'll know when I talk about crisis intervention, I talk mostly about prevention, because the first thing I like to do is to not have crisis. I have scars all over my body from crisis work over the years. I've still got a pretty good duck on me. I've had stitches, I've had lots of bruises, and I wear lots of protective equipment when we're working with individuals who are, super high risk. And most of those scars came before we were adding as much as we do now. But it is really important to know your environment. And again, we can't change everything, but I would say in today's design, we love to add glass windows. We love to add these, like, they're beautiful spaces. And I look at them and go, do I have to bring someone through here if they're really upset? So even though I can't change all of that, I really want to know where my risk is. So any environment I work in, we are building a new complex care tower and emergency room at Cincinnati Children's. And I have, we'll be walking our teams through. It opens in November, and we'll be walking our teams through get intimate with that environment to understand what are our new risks, what are our new, kind of challenges going to be. Even though they've designed some areas to be very safe, et cetera. We know the whole place won't be. It's going to be a beautiful new space. So we know we're going to have these areas that we have to think about, but we will appropriately plant even just mats or blocking pads in certain areas so that they're always accessible. And we'll do that for our teams who work with this population all the time. I can't run to the next building to grab my blocking pad, and I can't carry it with me everywhere I go. But if I have them on every floor, then they're quickly accessible when we're in a crisis that we didn't expect. So those are some of the kind of systems work that we end up doing across the system that we didn't arrive at the first day. So again, glass windows or surfaces. And I think both about what can be broken, but who's going to be bothered if the patient in one room is banging? Because sometimes we're more worried about what other people think or somebody else's stress that it's causing, and which is fine to do, but we can't just put a lid on somebody's stress to protect someone else's stress. So it is about just all of that environmental management, kind of where we're placing people, how we're doing it, and what's around us. So our current emergency room, they have adapted the back hallway, this back area, cleared those rooms out pretty significantly, but it keeps them away from more of the patients who are, I would say, more sick with less behavioral health risk, so that it's a little quieter. But what we do get by putting them all in the same area is if they're screaming and banging, and somebody else is bothered by screaming and banging, they may actually have to hear each other, and we have to adapt to that. So there's always a give and take no matter where you put them. Just saying that there's not perfection, it's just how do we get improvement. Elopement. So this is not getting married. This is actually when we run out of a place without permission, right? So we have to think about, in all of our environments, where might somebody escape easily if they want to get out of here? So most of our hospital units have back hallways down the stairs. And then we have our front unit doors. Ours lock. Our unit doors are all locked now. And that didn't used to be, and we came to that. We came to that for safety from other fronts as well, not letting people come and go as they felt on units anymore. But the other part was just helping contain, because we have a high level of behavioral health population in our units. And so to prevent that elopement. But our back hallways, because of fire egress, are always open, the stairwells. And so we know that's a risk, and we think about the placement of our patients because of that. Same thing in the emergency room. if they were going to get out, where can they go? And our staff have to know that. So we have plans. If somebody gets out of the room, we know exactly where our gaps are so that we can identify and mitigate. So really this environmental assessment will save you so much time when people just know where your holes are. And we can't plug them all, but we can have a plan for them. Head banging. So the risk to the environment um, you know, are there a lot of surfaces with heavy corners? What do the walls look like in terms of, are they glass? Are they going to break? Are there windows? And what do we have to block those kinds of things? Staff, if staff don't have things to block with, they use their hands. And it's been a long time since I've seen a broken finger from blocking head banging, because we have so many mats and pads around now that they don't have to do that anymore. And so, but when a child is really slamming their head against something, people are going to try to intervene, and it's often with that hand, which will break pretty quickly. So making sure we have ways to mitigate that. Again, same thing with throwing or property destruction. A lot of our rooms have so much material in them for the medical piece, what can be pulled out, what can't, and making sure that we have strategies to manage. We can't take it all out, but we have to be able to manage it. Sensory inputs, so those alarms, et cetera. So we have to think in advance, what can we do about that input? And having medical teams think about, I can move to, we'll have the sensors on them, but we're only going to hook them up every 45 minutes to check their vitals. Or they might need continuous monitoring, and that's okay, but thinking about that. We have to have that for the medical purpose, but how are we going to mitigate that, because we have to have it? So what are we going to do to help kind of get them through that in terms of distraction, prevention of pulling, et cetera? So there's all scenarios, but sometimes we find that we can actually cut out some of the needs for lines and things. It might not be the optimal way we want to get it, but we can still get it in a way that's going to help their medical care without overstressing. So it's just always this balance. And then what do we do with aggression, right? So, and it's towards them, we need to block, but also towards our staff. And so we were able to launch a big portion of our safety work at Cincinnati Children's because of staff injury. I got called, my first meeting I was invited to, maybe drugged to, was 3 kids had caused 40 staff injuries in a month. They all had autism. And bless their little hearts, and significant medical challenges, and they were really struggling. And the teams were just working so hard. They really were working so hard, but they were doing many, many things that exacerbated the behavior, not intentionally, but because they did not have the training. And we were able to, with some input, able to pretty quickly get those children on some plans that got them moving forward better. And out of that, we developed an entire system. So that started the work, it launched the work, but it was truly injury that got the feet under it, of people realizing, like, we aren't doing a good job here. We have to do this better. And these children were getting their medical care. They weren't getting discharged because they were hurting people. But they certainly, it was certainly challenging to give them the care they needed, with everybody getting injured. So we were able to work on that effectively. So just some quick things for adapting the environment. Some things you can do without having to renovate, right, is where you choose your rooms. And obviously when hospital rooms get opened, you take what's open, right? We don't always have the best room available, et cetera. We put patients wherever. But when we know what rooms are the best and where their locations are the best, even if we have to put a patient in one room, we can often move them as that room opens. So still everybody understanding what are the best rooms in this unit, in this emergency room, in this area. We have pre-identified kind of the best options with a variety of things that we have. So our nurses on our floors right now know this room's bigger, this room's smaller, this room has the glass door, this room has a wooden door, this room, I can shut the water off, this room, I can, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. They know their space, and they know that as they're placing kids, they might just get an open room, but I can move them as things open up and switch around. So we have what we call our frequent flyer patients who have chronic medical, who are going to come in and they'll their parents often know they'll start wherever, but then they'll get moved to the bigger room because that child needs space. We'd rather have them pacing a big room than the hallway. So especially with COVID. So all these things are just about knowing your environment and having all your teams know your environment and being able to think about how much that environmental management helps them manage the entire admission. Pulling out any items we don't need. So every room has an environmental checklist. We know what's in each room and we know what we can pull and what we have to mitigate based on that room. And so being able to do that is super helpful. We have mats and bed rails all over. We have a sewing room, volunteer sewing individuals who they will make us bed rails for, we can also order the standard ones like whatever, but we've had people volunteer and make these bed rails. So we have them in specific locations at our hospital. We can deploy them to any room. They usually called seizure pads, but now we have, we use them for way more than seizures. We use them for a lot of head banging or flailing that's unsafe, etc. So all of those things, again, are just in certain locations across the hospital, and then we can deploy them as needed. And now unit staff know to ask for them and go get them. And some use them so often that they've just established their own on their unit. The ability to have natural light and get rid of the fluorescence. Most of our rooms have nice windows, so we can just shut off the light and use the window during the day, but have a variety of lights that we can dim or change, and that helps. And then again, managing those noises. What can we do in the room? When we can't stop those, will the child wear headphones? Sometimes with music and sometimes just sound deafening, those kinds of things. And then trying to get the kids to also not put too much stimulation on. Sometimes we let them do the iPad and the TV and they're doing a musical toy and everything at the same time, which can actually overstimulate them as well. So just trying to help our staff manage and just do one thing at a time so that they're not overwhelming their environment when we've cleared it out. So just a couple pictures, you can take an emergency room and you look at the normal medical care and then one that's been cleared out. Now, obviously, this isn't going to happen quickly, or you wouldn't want every room to look like this. But when you have patients who come in who may not need the higher level medical care, it is nice to have these kind of de-stimulated rooms that are just safe. And it's so much easier for staff and parents and everyone to manage because you're only bringing in what you need. So if you are on the way to do renovations or looking at moving towards this, super, super helpful. We have a lot of these TVs. You can see in the photo on the right, it's encased and that helps it from not getting pulled down or banged. And so people, if they're banging on that, people can actually, if they're just hitting it with their fist, people can just ignore that because it's not going to hurt the TV or the cabinet. And we're able to then just focus on de-escalation and redirection versus trying to keep them from pulling the TVs off the wall kind of a thing. And of course, when you need to do crisis medical care, you need these rooms with all the things in them. And that is absolutely appropriate and okay. But just thinking about what can be pulled out if needed or what can be in the cabinet. For some kids who are scared of medical care, this is a really scary room. For kids who are curious and can't stop touching everything, this is like a science experiment in here. So just understand your environment. We can't change it all, but we have to understand what might be triggering in the environment. This other one has the glass windows. Again, I've seen our PICU doors are all glass and the whole thing will pop out because that's how you get the stretchers in and out, right? And I've seen kids learn that and they flail them their whole body across. We got this door coming off. So, and again, we can mitigate that, but the first time it happened, I was a little bit surprised because I didn't even know the door did that. So again, so I prefer you not learn how I learned a lot of things across the hospital and that you actually go through your rooms and understand what the risks are before you get surprised when a child's coming through a glass door. So again, that renovation may not happen. So taking the time to make sure you understand them, but then that the staff understand the risks and what this particular population may do it. So this is really staff training. And then do they know how to modify? Do they know what's allowed per policy? Do they have permission to do this? When they run into a thing that might change policy, do they know how to escalate it to have that determination of, can I do this? Should we do this? Is it safe to do this? Is it safer to leave it, safer to take it? There's a whole escalation strategy that needs to happen across the hospital. Do they have ideas for how to adapt care to reduce stress? We have Cincinnati Children's is giant, and we not all teams, have the same experience for sure. So we often have nurses who will ask the physicians to say, hey, they're really struggling with this. Can we adapt it? Can we, how much monitoring do you need to make sure that, we're medically safe? And we'll just work with that team. And we have doctors who have learned to receive that conversation with what we call grace and gratitude, so that they can actually just have a conversation, and they don't perceive it as somebody trying to manipulate their medical care. And that's an important cultural thing. We didn't have that years ago, 15 years ago. We do now, because they're understanding that they're not trying to manipulate medical care. They're trying to help this child manage their hospitalization so that we're all more safe. So getting everybody on board to have those critical conversations is a huge, important part of your culture to make sure that exists. If it doesn't, we just run into this conflict all the time, and trying to get the teams to work together to help the patient and family tolerate care. And those nurses they're in there all the time. And so they're so key to that conversation. So we don't have very many rooms that water shuts off, but we do have a few across our hospital. And we have moved patients to those rooms specifically. I had a young man who had I think it's called the Whipple procedure. He had chronic pancreatitis, but he couldn't drink. And we had this, and he couldn't drink because with his intubation, he had a traumatic intubation. And so like he wasn't a safe swallow. He did get it back and it was able to be fine, but we were trying not to have him drink thin liquids, but he was like a chronic obsessive drinker. So we were fighting him over the sink because he just want to put his mouth on that sink and load up. And so it was this constant battle. So we were able to look across rooms and find a room that we could shut the water off at the sinks and lock the bathroom door, and then manage that much better. And, life for everybody went better once we could do that. And then once his swallow improved, then we were able to get him back on drinking, and it didn't matter which room he was in. But that meant his team had to go off unit for their normal unit because he was on a GI unit. So we had to move him to a different unit to get that care, but everybody adapted to it, and it took the stress down for everyone because it was just an unsafe situation. So really just thinking creatively around those situations and having ways for teams to work together to solve problems across your hospital is super important. And then Dr. Nunclair has talked a lot about, just how do we help them cope? So predicting changes. Hospitals are what I call hurry up and wait. I mean, they're either fast or you're waiting forever. That's what it feels like from the parent perspective, right? So like we're either doing 14 things in a row, or we know we're gonna have a procedure and it takes 3 days to get there. So, and sometimes when things come through, they come through quickly. Sometimes if they're coming from different consultants, they can come back to back to back to back. And these are some of the hardest things that we have to navigate for people with autism. So really trying to kind of work with the team to say, we have these things to do, but helping allowing the nurses to help kind of pace some of that, helping the parents pace and give input into that within the parameters, knowing that it'll back other things up too. So there's a lot of conflicting things that have to go together to make these things work, but it's really just important about having the conversations and being able to structure and organize and put things together. I would say this was really challenging when I first started working in the inpatient side, but it's just become way more seamless and part of our culture now to be able to think about those things and talk about them. So it used to be, kids get added on for something because they need it, and they're going to be NPO for for that add-on, which might not come till 3 p.m. And this is a patient whose biggest trigger is to be without food. And they're 15 and 6 foot and 250 pounds. And I got a 1-to-1 staff in there with them, with the mom, right? So what am I looking at? That's unsafe. We might have to do a lot of pre-medication to keep this child stable, So what we'll often do is say, if we wait 2 days, we can get a time at 10 a.m. And so it makes more sense to wait 2 days to get time for that procedure in the OR than it does to put this child on a wait list, which actually might not even happen. And then they've been NPO all day because it's just not safe. So we're just balancing those conversations we used to have to bring up from a behavioral standpoint every time. And now our teams, occasionally we have to do it, but it's rare. Most of the times our teams are like, I know this child can't do NPO that time. We're not adding on. We're going to do this procedure in 2 days. And we got an early time. So those come over time, but it's really about giving your team's permission to do that really great problem solving, to keep everyone safe, to manage that autistic individual's triggers, and it might add on a little bit to the admission. And so you have to look at that as well. And talking with the parents about those options, they may choose something different too and want to get through something, but just really having that collaborative approach is super helpful. Timers and schedules help, especially when these things are coming. They help us keep engagement, let them know what's coming next. We really encourage people to keep them on schedule with meals and snacks if they can eat, and try to keep their days and nights going. At the hospital, I always say we don't know what day and night is. People are always in your room at night and they're always doing things. What can we do to collaborate care as well? But just using those visual schedules and timers are super helpful. We're going to talk in the toolkit about not having to develop a new schedule for every patient. You need to develop toolkits. Your staff need to have these at the ready. They need to be easy to find and do. Otherwise, it takes too many days to get them up before you, and then you've lost time in terms of your ability to keep that child safe. We all do better when we're busy. I don't know how many of you have been at an airport when the flight got canceled, but there's two different types of people in the world. Those who go and get rescheduled and go buy a magazine or a book and sit and have a snack or a drink and read or do something else. And those who stand at the counter and scream at the staff because they can't get over the fact that they can't get where they need to go in the way they need to go. And part of that is probably the why and their timeline. But other parts of it are, as we heard this morning, rigidity, the ability to adapt to change, etc. But what we do know with any person is that when they can be kept busy and your brain is engaged, if your brain is engaged positively, you're spending less time worrying about other things going on around you. And so we need to make sure there's the variety of activities and things to keep children busy. Many parents did not plan to get admitted to the hospital, so they don't come with everything they need. And so we need to make sure hospitals have a variety of things to choose from. And when we think about autism, often we don't have great toy play. So sometimes we have 15-year-olds who want kind of cause and effect things of a younger child, and that is okay. And sometimes that isn't really even where their interest is. It's actually just a routine. It's a rigidity. And that it doesn't mean they don't understand or they're functioning like a 2-year-old. So it's just important to kind of, again, take that judgment away and just think about the different activities and interests that you have across the hospital and have a variety of those. And the sensory items are often huge to just have little things that they can interact with in a sensory way. We find out what they like by asking the family and sometimes bringing in some things to sample. And then we want to think about too, with this person, if they tend to be a thrower or tend to hit with items, trying to keep super hard things out of their reach. Or we have ways, we have iPads that can go on loan and they have covers, but we actually have a way to connect them to the bed so they can't get thrown and hit the floor. So we just do lots of different things to help keep things safe and instead of taking that away from the child completely, which is going to make it hard for their day, we have ways to kind of make it safe and just manage it. So all those come with a lot of thinking and planning, and again, having your staff know kind of what the options are with those different things. So that's kind of the part one on the environment. I wanted to give time for lots of questions because we tend to get a lot of questions about the environment or how things are adapted. So I don't know if there's anything in the chat, Melinda.
Yes, Dr. Nanclares is going to ask you a few questions that have come up in the chat. So I'll let her take on those questions.
So the first question actually was a question that I had, in terms of, Renee, sorry, did it again.
It's okay.
Regarding, just kind of some of these unpredictable situations, right? I had worked very closely with an inpatient unit, helping them understand, kind of some of these adaptations that they could use. And they had gotten a couple of iPads that they could use as distractors because they knew that devices oftentimes were great. And then at one point they called me that, one child had gone through all 4 iPads in one sitting, right? And what they had failed to grasp in this situation is that if the child is, upset, they might get upset by things that don't go their way in the iPad as well, right? And so this child kept on flinging iPads. They would shatter and they would promptly bring the next iPad. And so literally this child went through 4 iPads in, I want to say, like a half-hour span. I was horrified. So in part, it was maybe not clear communication on my part in terms of, how to use these things. So how have you worked with things like that in the past, or what situations have you run into where maybe you tried to help someone prepare, but then, these little things that you were like, didn't think about, kind of clarifying that.
Right. And that's a common kind of a situation. So I would like to say it's rare, but it's not. So for things like iPad, we've done things like been able to clip them on if we know that the person has a history of throwing. And one of the parts of that is again, gathering, we gather behavioral information on any person who's admitted with behavior risk. So they're screened for risk, and then we gather information on what are those behaviors. So we tend to know if this child is going to be a thrower. And then we think about what's being brought in the room and how we're interacting and what triggers that. But we can set limits, right? So say you get an iPad and it's broken, it is okay to not bring in another iPad because we can't just keep replacing, and behaviorally we wouldn't. But it is helpful to know, again, from the parents, of how do they do with an iPad? How do they do with video games? How do they do? And some parents are like, oh, they love them, but they get mad when this happens, or etc. The other problem I see is we'll give kids an iPad. I have one right now. He's a ward of the state, little guy, he's 5. And came in from a foster care with agitation, but they are not taking him back, and he's stuck on placement, right? And we are using an iPad with him, but he quickly becomes obsessive with the iPad and is mad any time we take it away. So like from a behavioral perspective, we have, my team works behaviorally, and so we are teaching him to use an iPad appropriately, and that's part of the intervention with his bedside staff. So for many kids, things they love is also going to be that thing that they don't want to put down when they have to do a procedure, that they don't want to put down when they have to do care. So the schedules and the timers and the routines are super important to build that in from the get-go. So it is rarely that we can just give them an iPad and say, you're great. We have many kids who come in with phones now, and they don't want to put them away to go to bed. And we will work with their families. If the family says, oh, they can have it all the time, we may not fight it. But if we're getting really stressed, we'll typically work with the family to say, we'd like to put them on a normal routine, take it out by a certain time. We plug it in out at the huck station so that it's out of the room, or we'll lock it up. But we work with that as a team. And so almost just like any child, a lot of the things we give them have to be managed. And the team has to have kind of supports and resources to figure out how to manage that. And again, we typically work with the parent to understand what the normal risks are, and then thinking about how to navigate it. But we also have patients that come in that do not get iPads, do not get certain things because they are really destructive to them. And we just don't have the resource to be able to keep supplying them. And we set a limit because we have to. So the families can bring in theirs if they would like, and we will still tether it and do all the things we can, but we can't necessarily give it all, or we'll arrange times where that will come in with a higher trained staff for a small bout of time with it as a kind of a reinforcer for something. So it's about a lot of creative behavior management when you have those situations.
Yeah, and that's,
which often goes
a great
beyond a nurse.
segue. Oops, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, it's a great segue. The resource aspect is a great segue to one of the questions is, do you find that your hospital is supportive with funding for adapting environments or obtaining items for patients with ASD, or do you often have to find external sources for funding? Yeah, that's a
Yes.
great question.
How about both? Those are great questions. So we do get small amounts in the budget, but we try to work really across the hospital. So the behavior safety team in itself has a supplies budget, and a lot of those are safety aspects. So our protective equipment, extra pads, et cetera. But we also try to have units who are high use join us on that budget for some of those items, especially if they want them really frequently. And with our child life, which we have integrated into behavior safety, but also outside, we often have some budget for items around there, and then we pay extra to get them very safety, big covers for our iPads, and things that we can tether them, and we do lots of things. We use a lot of like the chewy tubes and things too, and we have ways to clip them to the shirts to try to not to lose them. We'll often say a patient can't have more than 2 because they're very expensive. If the family wants to bring in more, they can do that. So we set limits on our resources, but we definitely do have a hospital leadership who understands that part of our budget needs to go towards things that help these individuals stay stable. And that's part of the safety. It's not just putting pads on our staff. It's actually helping our patients have a good experience here and learn to tolerate care really well. And what they have found with that resource is that we have patients who over time don't need us anymore. They learn to do their care well. And then they can come in and they use, we're spending more time with the patients who need us at bedside because we've got you kind of with really well adapted care.
That's great. Yeah.
And our injuries are down. So.
Right. That's the big one, right? And part of that accepting and positive environment that you were talking about also, and that I had mentioned, and creating an experience that then will be a positive experience. So next time the person needs to be there, it'll be less of a battle too, right? Mm-hmm. So I think we might have time. We have a couple of minutes only, but maybe time for one more question. And the question is, how do you encourage staff to keep the routine? This is a great question. It's hard sometimes to have the staff stay consistent, right? So maybe some tips, quick tips on that.
Yes, and I pause because my brain goes to yesterday. So I would say we always have some seasoned staff who have learned, right? Who have learned that when we stay on track, it goes really well. But we always have new staff. There's always turnover, new people coming in. And we find that unit culture matters. So we have some units that just flows seamlessly and they just learn it as part of that culture on the unit. Some of it can be how much work we've done on a specific unit. We did pilot work on some specific units and they did tend to get a little bit more probably in training. But a lot of it goes towards that leadership and the willingness for the leaders to walk the walk and talk the talk and kind of tell their teams they have to kind of work with these structures and consistency, and these resources aren't necessarily an option to be ignored, or a behavior plan isn't necessarily something that we ignore, but it's something that we speak to in the sense that if it's not working, there's trouble with it, we bring that back to the table and say, hey, we're struggling with this, or we're struggling with these types of things. And that takes a lot of time to build and just a lot of communication and going back. So as we've worked over time, we have to do a lot of educating, trying to meet everybody where they're at, understand kind of why the routine is. And sometimes the staff actually do a good job and it's the family that changes the schedule. So we have to do a lot of parent training on that side. But sometimes the parents are great with the schedule and it's the staff who's trying to modify it. So it is pretty much every area. And I would say it's similar to any other, what I'm going to call behavioral work that we do, is that getting strategies run with integrity is hard. And it requires constant effort. And knowing, again, I know I can get a referral on this unit and know that that's going to be more work than when I get it on this unit. And part of that is just the leadership. So we just keep working and pairing with leaders and trying to continue to educate and working with their educators. So it's just this trying to look at that whole system rather than is it just a staff issue, or is it across a unit, or is it, and addressing it at the right level.